And let me say again, there's an article on, I have at least 5 or 6 articles on Agile at ellenbeeman.com, easy to remember. And check them out, and again, email me questions at any time. I know I owe you an email on questions. I'm just saying, I have been buried this week with this silly jury duty thing. All right, so okay, so I already covered a little of this before. The whole point in Agile in general is it's defining the goals of the work and testable outcomes, not how the work will be done. So if I'm writing an Agile story, there are definitely things that I don't do. Like I don't say, and write a schema of this exact specifications, blah, blah, blah. There are going to be things that, for example, a database schema, we need to be able to handshake. So I'll need to say, okay, maybe there are some field names that need to be defined, but I'm not going to say how to do the work. We want the team to own that and decide how they should do the work. So yeah, the main thing here is, and this is why I was really hoping Chris would be here, is because you would get completely different viewpoints on how to write stories from the two of us. So ask him about that when he is here next. In particular, everybody likes to have their own way of writing a story. So this is going to be all about my approach. Your mileage may vary. I recommend it's all about what works for the team. Not what works for you, what works for the team. So please try different approaches if you're going to start using stories. So I'm going to go into each of these, but this is the format that I like. Again, for student teams, you're probably going to want to ditch some of these because it may be too heavyweight for what you're doing. Okay. So this is actually the one that I am like the most fanatical about, is the as the player. So I don't want to say this story is write the tutorial. No. I want to start writing about the story, and let me just add, my work experience in the last few companies has been the producer is the product owner, is the story writer. So I'm going to refer to all of you as story writers at this point, on the presumption that that's a role you would take on for your team, is writing requirements. So I always start with as the customer, which almost always is the player, but not always. I want to learn how to play the game. It's kind of a mental exercise more than anything else. It just helps me keep in mind, this is not about me, this is not about the team, this is about the player who we are creating this experience for. Yeah, sometimes it gets weird. And at that point, I may just say, as QA, we want, test cases, and just not bother with that. So it is possible to have a customer who is not the player. For example, plenty of times working on Marvel Superhero Squad, the customer was marketing, not even the player. We have, here are requirements for the Del Monte advertising campaign we did, where we printed 3 million codes. It was great fun. And there's nothing quite like printing 3 million codes and watching your production database go, because you have to run them off the live servers. That's all. We always picked like 3 in the morning for it. But in any case, that would be, as marketing, I want all the materials I need to support the Del Monte advertising campaign. And then that would be the list of requirements would follow. Description. So continuing with we're making a tutorial. Description, 3 to 4 levels that are designed to be tutorial levels and teach the core mechanics to the player. So the description may be redundant from your title, but may not. Yeah.
You have the title is the full title as the player I want that full sentence is the title.
Yeah. So like I say, sometimes your description becomes redundant. But it's a good start to defining what you're doing for the player. So this is getting very, very specific with requirements. But again, this is the testable outcome. So generally, how I approach writing requirements is I don't just sit in my tower and and write these in my fortress of solitude. I sit with the person who's going to be doing the work, and I'm like, let's talk through the initial requirements. So that person has an immediate voice in it. They're not the last person to have a voice in it, but they're the first with me. And this is important because I've certainly written stories for things like server programming. Server programming was always fun on the last project I was at Glue because we would get to the voting part of how long it would take, and everybody would be like, none of us are server programmers except the server programmer. So we would not be able to vote very well. But again, this is all something where either your team or somebody in the professional QA department at a regular studio would be able to just check these off and be able to confirm that the work was done. And actually, this is this is from the game we shipped last year. So specifics like it has to have an end gate and it has to have collectible stars. Okay, so dependencies, again, this is where you're getting into the realm of, up to this point, I feel very strongly these are useful things for your team. This may already be the point where it's like, this could be already overloading your team, but could be really useful. So sample dependency on my Girl Genius tutorial levels was we were continuously adjusting the jump code in physics, but bias towards action. I'm not going to wait on creating a tutorial until all that's done, because then we'll be horribly late. So they can be created, but they can't be finalized. And assumptions. So this is actually this is more useful for when you're at a studio using Agile professionally. This is basically telling QA, we know, don't fail our story. Don't get to the verification and say you didn't finish it because we have placeholder art, or we are missing audio, or like this, our textures came in very, very late in the process. A tremendously talented artist who is just a little slow. And so a lot of things had placeholder stuff. You look like question?
So it's kind of like a reminder of some sort of things that exist that are very, very relevant to the story or to the work that needs to be done, but it's already done. So,
or that it's going to be done at some later date. The assumption, yeah.
So you can take your assumptions and write new stories based off of those.
Oh yes. So in this context, I had my backlog of ridiculous numbers of stories, some of which we never got to because that's how development works. And yeah, we had backlog items, which is, Cheyenne still owes us half the object textures, and it'll be nice when we get them, just to make sure that we don't lose them. But I'm just going to say, on the subject of placeholder content, I did learn one very painful lesson working on Superhero Squad Online with Chris Vanover, which is never enter, so you can have art that is not valid, but never have numeric data that is like, oh, this is going to change later. Always try to have something that you want to ship with. Because we shipped with it was a mission starring The Thing, and it shipped with the low cost that I had entered for the QA department so that they could test it without having to load up their accounts with lots of fake money beforehand. Never, ever, ever do that. We shipped it. It made it all the way through QA, and none of us caught it. And so it was supposed to be a purchasable item that was basically free. And at that point, I told QA, I will personally add money to your accounts. We're never doing this again. But this is just a general caveat of be careful with placeholder, because sometimes you ship it painfully. Yeah.
So a good example for an assumption would be like on our team, right? We're already doing like an action system for testing.
Right.
And so the story could be about implementing the action system. The assumption could be later on we're going to be using this for
Right.
animation.
So for something like that, I would make sure, so we want it to be testable. So you have to have something in there which is some enemy that you can just verify against, but you may want to say it's a placeholder enemy. We're going to replace it later. So keep in mind, because we're all about verification. Somebody's saying, oh yeah, I wrote the scripting system. No, that's not good enough. Must be verifiable, must be testable.
And not always assumptions are going to be placeholders.
Yeah, assumptions could something, I mean, I list placeholder because that's usually what it turns out to be, but I'm trying to think what are other assumptions I've done other than placeholder. Man, I mean, mostly I'm coming, all the bad art that we had as placeholder on the last project is wiping out the memory of everything else. But yeah, it also could be, it could be something like, the server, yeah, known bugs. So we know there's a bug in the server code. We aren't fixing it yet because we're continuing with client work. But we know, and here's what it is. Yeah, sure.
But as an example, I think seeing in a project that I'm working on currently is that I need to be implementing movement currently, and we intend to have our movement system go through an action list system.
Right.
But we're not writing the action list system until later because we have more important things we're working on now. So I'm just bypassing that completely. But an assumption be there will be an action list system to handle this specific thing.
Yeah, just make sure it's also in your backlog, because that's the kind of thing that gets lost. And let me just add, when you're writing stories, I'm a fan of a huge, ridiculous backlog. Every idea that you might want to do, put it in the backlog. Everything like an assumption, put it in the backlog, because otherwise you'll forget about it and you'll miss it. Yeah, Joe?
With a team that use personas, and if so, could
Oh,
you
yes.
work into stories in any way, like rather than saying as a player, as a specific persona I want.
Right. So I have worked with personas. Actually, there's an article up on my blog about a project I did redesigning the Girl Genius website, which was all around personas, because they have hundreds of thousands of fans, and heaven forfend I redesign the website and forget about any of the doom. So yeah, you might say something like, as the persona Rachel, I want this, because yeah, it may not apply to the other personas. I know Rich talks about personas. I went over that when he started teaching the class. But yeah, if you've got personas are an awesome thing that take a little while to wrap your head around, and it's very easy to do them poorly. I worked on the original Surface team, and I was new to Microsoft, and so I didn't know this. But our personas that were created by the more experienced PMs were nonsense, and they were not examples of real people. And that's kind of an essential part of using a persona. It has to be genuinely somebody who is going to be an example, typify a group of customers. It can't typify a group of non-customers. So just something to be careful on. But yeah, I could talk endlessly about personas. It is a weird thing, though. It takes a while to go, wait, we're designing this game for some person who doesn't exist. It's like, okay. But it is a useful thing.
So persona refers to like a customer, but what?
You're ITS, right? You're not going to take R260, I bet, or GAT260. Okay, so Alan, do we want to add personas to the list? Because there's going to be a lot of people who, it could be a whole topic, easily. I could spend a while. So, but briefly, or bring in somebody to talk about it more to the point. The intent is more guest speakers, just so we're clear. Yeah, briefly, a persona is a fictional character who encapsulates a group of customers. So I'm trying to think for, okay, Joe, for your game, which is this big action title, well, boss fights, big dragon and all this, you might have the all action all the time kind of persona. You might have the person who's more, I'm a little more hesitant, I'm going to think things through, I'm going to build up to a big effect kind of player. We will call those, Fred and George, and kind of come up with just things about them. Could be including age and the kinds of games they play and things like that. So we make sure that the game is addressing those people. Yeah. So
Sometimes they'll include paintball players, so you have some uniform and such. So that might incorporate the way they build it and everything.
yeah.
Achievements first.
What are the types called?
Bartle, B-A-R-T-L-E, for Richard Bartle. Fantastic concept, the Bartle types, and somewhat strange. You take the test and you find out weird things about yourself.
So, my final thing, because I'm really strict like this, but I don't want to obviously.
Yeah, our only thing is we have a hard stop for my husband's class.
So, like, it would be, so personas would be like a representation of some sort of market or
Mhm.
sort of.
Mhm.
Okay.
A demographic. So the problem with the Surface was once we realized what the price point was, our personas were like, the working mom with 3 kids. No, this is now a high-end consumer device. Our persona is the CEO of a company or something like that. We didn't change them, and that was an unfortunate decision in retrospect. But yeah, it's the idea is it's group, it's a single person, fictional person, typifying a group of potential customers. So notes is probably one you actually do want, which is just anything else goes here. The level editor is now located at this new location, just so I don't forget when I'm working on the tutorial. So it's really anything where assets are located, required assets, things like that could go into your notes. It's not necessarily essential, like I need to know this about working on the story. It's more just useful info. All right. So yeah, here's that story all together. As the player, I want to learn how to play the game. So that means some levels. That means tutorial text. That means at least one mechanic being taught. Because if it's not teaching a mechanic, it's not a tutorial level. Fully playable, can't be finalized, placeholder textures, just basic how you would do it. So then you may be like, so that really didn't actually cover everything. So here's things that perhaps I need to tutorialize. I would add those into the story. So that was an okay story, but this makes it a much more complete story in that I'm not just going, teach some mechanics. I'm going, no, teach these specific mechanics. Steam hammers and spike plates kill you dead. I'm going to teach this to you. I mean, it's gonna vary. If you do all of these things, it'll probably be about a page. It shouldn't be that long. It shouldn't be that long. And there's a difference between a story and a spec. So, and that's kind of tricky because there's still companies that do, massive design docs and things like that. The story is very abbreviated from a spec. And part of that is a big part of the Agile philosophy is avoid waste. And the idea is, could I do this work off of the information in that story? Yeah, maybe not. Maybe I need more info about the exact scripting I need to do for these, but do I need a spec written for it? No, what I need to do is chase down some code, make sure the assets are all there, and then get started. So in this case, a spec, probably not really needed. Some footwork on my part, but not really a spec. Keep in mind, though, that there are studios that still love the big, thick design Bibles and things like that. So you can have, in fact, the last studio was one of these, where we had massive design specs that I then trimmed down, into stories with just the info that people needed to work on that one feature. To me, that's kind of silly, but this was a studio where they wanted the design docs up front, even though it was an internal studio, kind of like an external studio relationship, where part of the we get paid for our design work is we deliver big, thick Bibles of work. Your mileage may vary out there in the professional world. So I just was talking about this. Yeah, the main thing to keep in mind is that I don't want to discount design specs because they can have a valuable role, but this is the main thing. Agile stories are about testable outcomes. Here are these things that accomplish these goals. A QA person can literally just go down the list and go, yep, hit every single one. Now, let me see. One thing that will happen, and I will just warn you, is if you start using this process with your teams, you will discover that you wrote a story, and we got testable outcomes, and we've got as the player, we're doing good. And the work gets done, and you realize, no, actually there was more work needed, and we didn't do it. You write that as a separate story. You don't, in the middle, this is that whole breaking the sprint thing. You don't, in the middle, say, hey, I need you to change this whole thing because we didn't think about it. You get the most best work out of people by giving them an uninterrupted sprint in which to work. So we try desperately not to break the sprint. So I talked about this a little bit. Yeah, this is how I work. And I'm very fond of this process because it's great for people who hate the idea of meetings. And since I'm one of those people, I don't particularly love long meetings. I like to work this way. So again, like I mentioned, I meet with each person who's going to be doing the work. We talk about it. I write the story. And then this is the big one. The sprint planning, I would put up on a projector the stories, and everybody would comment on them, and we would always have changes. I terribly miss my friend Liz, who was my QA lead at Glue, because she would always be like, Ellen, I think you forgot something, and she'd always be right, and it was awesome, because that's bringing that, so the old school producer sort of, runs the team and doesn't need input and all of that. The new school producer gets lots and lots of feedback and changes things as needed. So I would constantly be like, oh, let me add that to the story. Everybody good with that? Now this is the part that I really like for professional teams, may not be as useful, could be useful for student teams, which is tasking, which is after we agree on the story, the person who's going to be doing the work writes out a task list of what they're going to get done. I personally like this because it is another chance very early in the process to find things we missed. Oh, sure, I thought I'd have the renderer done in 3 days. Turns out, when I look at all the tasks, it's more like 2 weeks. Stuff like that happens. And so I personally think this is a kind of a belt and suspenders approach to catch those, but your mileage may vary. So yeah, this is one where I do recommend, so odds are, since so many companies are now switching to Agile, seeing the benefits of Agile, I do recommend the idea of having a team member take a turn writing a story. Or maybe you sit together and that person mostly writes the story, but you're providing feedback as they're writing it. And that's kind of just getting everybody a little bit more involved in the process, but totally up to you. Yeah, let me emphasize this again. If nobody says anything in your sprint planning, like, hey, what about this? There's something wrong. There's almost certainly something that needs feedback, and for some reason, bless you, your team is not commenting on it. I'd look at that and try to solve that. So this is where I'm going to get into that slide that I'm going to click over really quickly. So that was writing stories. Now I'm going to talk about estimating. Estimating is one of these things that it is genuinely hard for teams to do. It's a difficult skill to learn, just to put it bluntly. The reason for it is it's real easy to say, oh yeah, I'll get that done this week. It's different to say, I am committing to getting that done this week because this will take X amount of points. And I do want to emphasize